A touch muted, perhaps in comparison to the events of the last big VE Day anniversary, yet still a nation subdued by pandemic turned out to remember one emerging from war. In Tonpentre in the Rhondda Valley, they stood a household apart today and invited their 94-year-old neighbour Ray Taylor, veteran air gunner of the RAF, to soak up the applause. How are you feeling today on the anniversary of VE Day?
I am happy that I'm here, but in all fairness, it seems a pity that all the lives were wasted, because they were all very young men.
Earlier, the Red Arrows took to the skies of London. There were flypasts in other nations of the UK. Where buglers sounded and silence followed to reflect on the human cost of abnormal times then and now.
The German war is therefore at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. Today is Victory in Europe Day.
75 years since Churchill added his voice to these famous scenes.
All over the capital, as indeed in towns and cities throughout the country, it was the same story.
Victory in Europe, but not in the Pacific. The complexities of so many shattered lives and the emerging horrors of Hitler's concentration camps never far from the surface. But for a time this was a moment of unbridled escapism, as this rare colour home movie footage from Gateshead, part of the British Film Institute's new VE Day film collection, shows. How much of a relief was it for you when VE Day finally came?
Oh, it was lovely, it was. It was lovely. I thought it'd never come, but it did, right?
D-Day veteran Arthur Moore was due to be at the Royal British Legion commemorations in London today. Instead, the shielders of old are shielded at home. And your thoughts today, what sort of emotions are you feeling today?
Well, I'm thinking of my pals, like, who I lost a few. Like, it's a sad day, really, but it's good to be alive.
Where a young Princess Elizabeth famously once danced into the night with the crowds, 75 years on, the enforced, largely crowdless streets of another national emergency amplify its distant echo. The Queen will address the nation tonight to mark one defining moment in our history in the midst of another, however different.
Yes, it is a strange time. It almost feels like this is our generation of managing something, nowhere near as awful as what happened, but it feels like it's our own little sort of managing something awful in the best way that we can. That's how it feels at the moment. But I think it is quite emotional, you know, and I think it's nice, like I said, just to show the gratitude, really, to that generation.
Maria Parry is one of the residents in Tonpentre who helped organise this moment for Ray Taylor.
I'm honoured because I never thought that, I mean, after all these years, for to be made a fuss of now, I mean, it's really nice, like, but it's very sad.
Well done, Ray. Not the grand set-piece moments as usual this time round. Salutes by the street, not the stage, but no less poignant for it.
Well, earlier I spoke to the historian James Holland and the comedian Al Murray, who together present the weekly World War II podcast, We Have Ways of Making You Talk. I started by asking what parallels could be drawn between what the world went through then, during the war, and the current coronavirus reality.
When you look at the war, there's the mythic idea that we all pulled together and everyone got along and we all put our shoulders to the collective yoke. Whereas what actually happened, to a great extent, is people grumbled, they complained, they didn't want to have to do this, they didn't want to have to do the blackout, they didn't want to take part, but they understood in the end this was the thing they were going to have to coalesce around. And even as the war progressed, you had all sorts of differences of opinion and arguments about what was going to come after and whether it was worth it and what you would get at the end of it, which is exactly the debate that's going on now. So when people invoke the war and go, oh, you know, we should all just shut up and get on with doing what we've been asked to do by the government, that's really not what happened. That's where I see the parallels as much as anything else, rather than, you know, is Boris Churchill, there you go, is Boris Johnson, Winston Churchill, are the ventilators the rifles that we need, and all this sort of stuff that people have been throwing about. I think it's the way we're handling it as a society is the really interesting thing, and the thing where there are tons of parallels.
But the difference is also that we're up against an invisible enemy here, as opposed to a dictator with a strange moustache. And this invisible enemy is inside us, right? If we're unlucky.
It's the germs, not the Germans. Yes, absolutely. But the lockdown is like the blackout. It's the same principle. You reduce the target opportunity for the enemy by changing your activity radically. And the blackout was the thing that inconvenienced the entire country and really, really narked people to a great extent, a lot like the lockdown. And, and they put up with that for an awfully long time. And the lockdown, the blackout, it incorporated danger as well, because you had to drive without your headlights on and all that sort of thing. So I think, from
a medical point of view as well, from the point of view, there's normal things that you would normally expect to be treated aren't being treated because there's other priorities, which is sort of battle casualties, people being bombed out and all the rest of it. So there are other comparisons as well, I suppose.
Well, indeed. And James, once again, we're also reliving this sort of eternal competition between Britain and Germany. We look at Germany's R numbers and, their infection rates and the numbers of ventilators and ICU beds with a degree of jealousy. And then again, we kind of check ourselves and say, well, actually, we're just different here, aren't we?
Yeah, I think one of the great strengths of Britain in the Second World War was its ability to prioritise and use its assets to the absolute maximum capability. And I would say that right now we're not quite harnessing that same approach, and I think the Germans are doing that an awful lot better. I think what's ironic is that, as a comparison to the Second World War, the Germans, for all their Tiger tanks and all the rest of it, were actually spectacularly inefficient in their approach to use of resources. And so actually you could almost sort of flip it the other way around, I think, as a comparison.
Al, I mean, one of the ironies here, of course, is that the heroes that we used to celebrate, or still celebrate today, are also invisible because they're too old to be allowed out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And actually, they've also been dying in huge numbers because of their age, because of pre-existing conditions, and some would say because of neglect in terms of our preparation for this war. That is a rather bitter irony, isn't it?
Well, yes, but I think it wouldn't be a British crisis without bitter irony ladled heavily into it. Is the truth? Yes, I mean this is the National Health Service, which is at the centre of this entire crisis, is after all the sort of the social contract byproduct of the Second World War. You can see why people are still harking back to it, because after all, the architecture of our society's ability to cope with it was built by the war.
James, Al earlier referred to the Boris Johnson-Winston Churchill conundrum. Do you think the closest thing that Boris will get to Winston is the book that he wrote about him?
I think so, yes. I mean, Al and I were talking about this a few weeks ago, and we actually decided the closer parallel was Chamberlain rather than Boris. Although, having said that, that was before he got COVID-19. And I think he's sort of seen in a much more favourable light, having kind of sort of been wounded in the front line.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got to make the parallel, I think austerity is going to turn into appeasement. It's going to be the thing that no one ever admits ever having supported, and that's regarded as the colossal mistake beforehand, probably.
And Al, you're the pub landlord. I mean, do you see yourself in a pub anytime soon? And what would that look like?
The pub landlord thinks he's engaged in some sort of British and Commonwealth world lock-in record.
Right. Drinking by himself.
Drinking by himself, working his way steadily through the contents of his cellar and living on pork scratchings alone. Okay. I mean, to some people, it's a perfect dream.